Have you ever looked into an old photograph and felt that someone inside it was trying to speak? In 1903, a family portrait was taken inside one of Salem's grandest homes, the Blackwood Mansion. At first glance, it seemed like an image of perfect grace and wealth, a proud father, a smiling mother, and their children arranged in quiet harmony. But if you look closer, one face breaks the illusion. A boy's pale, frightened eyes wide with something that feels like a silent scream. For over a century, no one questioned that photograph. No one wondered what had happened to the boy named Timothy Blackwood, or why his name quietly vanished from every public record soon after. Until decades later, an estate researcher uncovered a trail of letters, medical files, and hidden confessions, revealing the truth behind those terrified eyes. Tonight, we'll follow that trail through forgotten archives and sealed family histories. We'll listen to the whispers that echo behind a century of silence, and ask together what really happened to the child who tried to speak through a photograph. Welcome to Sleepy History Tales. In September of 2024, estate attorney Jennifer Hayes arrived in Salem, Massachusetts, a quiet town still haunted by its own history, to oversee the liquidation of the Blackwood family estate. The mansion, a towering Victorian relic wrapped in ivy and shadow, had stood on the edge of town for more than a century. Inside, its air carried the scent of dust and time, every room crowded with possessions accumulated by generations of a once celebrated New England dynasty. Hayes' task was simple: to catalog, to sell, to close a chapter that had lasted far too long. But as she wandered through the mansion's dim library, her eyes caught on something tucked neatly among the shelves: a small collection of family photographs kept with remarkable care inside leather-bound albums and old wooden boxes. Most of the images were ordinary for their time, formal portraits of stiff-backed patriarchs, elegantly dressed women, and solemn children who had been told not to blink. Yet one photograph, one single frame, refused to blend in. It was dated 1903, embossed with the mark of Mark Whitman Photography Studio, Boston. In the picture, the Blackwoods sat together in their ornate parlor, a vision of American prosperity. Charles and Margaret Blackwood poised like royalty, surrounded by their 4 children, each impeccably dressed in silk and tailored wool. Their smiles seemed genuine, their bodies relaxed, something rare for the era. Margaret's hand rested tenderly on her husband's shoulder, while the older children leaned toward one another, the warmth of family almost tangible. But there was one face that didn't belong. The youngest child, a boy perhaps 6 years old, stood beside his mother, yet apart from her. His expression didn't match the rest. His eyes, wide, hollow, and impossibly frightened, as if he were seeing something no one else in the room could. Jennifer Hayes stared at that face for a long time. The more she looked, the more wrong it felt, until she could no longer look at all. That photograph would become the beginning of an investigation, one that would reach far deeper into the Blackwood legacy than anyone had ever dared to go. Unable to shake her unease, Hayes turned to Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist known for studying human expression in historical photographs. He had made a career of decoding what families once tried to hide: resentment, abuse, fear. When Rodriguez examined the image, his conclusion was immediate and chilling. This child, he said quietly, is displaying signs of severe psychological trauma. He pointed out the details: the boy's body leaned subtly away from the adults, his small hands, clenched shoulders raised in defense, while the rest of the family looked either at the camera or lovingly at one another. His gaze was fixed not at the lens, but at something just beyond it. Something or someone outside the frame. His mouth was slightly open, caught in a soundless cry. And behind those eyes, that haunting, unfocused stare, Rodriguez saw what he described as dissociation, the child's mind retreating somewhere far away, even as his body remained perfectly still for the portrait. "He's here," Rodriguez murmured, but only barely. Whatever was happening in that house, he was trying to escape from it. That night, Jennifer Hayes sat alone beneath the mansion's high, echoing ceilings, the photograph still on the desk before her. The faces of the Blackwoods smiled out from the past, frozen in their golden age, all except for one. And as she began digging into the family's records from 1903, Salem, a troubling pattern began to surface, a lineage that had built its reputation on respectability, while hiding something far darker beneath. What secret had this family carried for over a century? And what exactly had that little boy seen just beyond the edge of the frame? The photograph of the frightened boy would soon prove to be more than just an eerie relic. It was a moment, a silent plea captured on glass more than a century ago, waiting for someone to finally see it. That child's expression, frozen in 1903, was about to give voice to victims who had been silenced for generations. As Jennifer Hayes delved deeper, the story of the Blackwood family began to unfold with the deceptive grace of a polished portrait. Charles Blackwood, the patriarch, had inherited a thriving textile empire, mills spread across Massachusetts, employing hundreds. He was celebrated as a man of means and moral stature. Newspaper articles from the early 1900s painted him as the very image of civic virtue, a benefactor of orphanages, a member of the city council, a man whose name commanded respect in Salem's social circles. His wife, Margaret, was no less admired, the elegant president of the Salem Ladies' Charitable Society, her name appearing often in the society pages beside lists of donations, charity balls, and glittering events. From the outside, the Blackwoods appeared to embody the golden ideal of their age, wealth, generosity, and family harmony. But the deeper Hayes looked, the more that golden surface began to crack. In the public record, something, or rather someone, was missing. The family's youngest child, Timothy Blackwood, born in 1897, seemed to barely exist at all. His older siblings, Charles Jr., Elizabeth, and little Margaret, appeared everywhere in school announcements, social gatherings, family correspondences. But Timothy's name vanished almost completely after 1905, as if he had been quietly erased. Seeking help, Hayes turned to Dr. Amanda Chen, a historian who specialized in New England genealogies. Together, they began to trace the lives of the 4 children, and what they uncovered only deepened the mystery. It's as if the family wanted Timothy hidden, Dr. Chen observed. The other children's lives were richly documented. Schools, travels, marriages into other prominent families, while Timothy's records were sparse, fragmentary, almost deliberately so. And then came the discovery that stopped Hayes cold. According to state death records, Timothy Blackwood had died in 1908 at just 11 years old. The cause of death, illness. No further details, no physician's notes, no obituary in the papers. Even stranger, The death certificate bore the signature of a doctor who appeared in no other Salem records, a man seemingly brought in for this single case. Timothy's funeral had been private, attended only by family. For a child of such a celebrated household, the silence was deafening. At Salem's Green Lawn Cemetery, Hayes found the final trace, a small headstone, its inscription worn and simple set, slightly apart from the rest of the Blackwood graves, as if even in death he had not been allowed to stand among them. It was becoming clear that Timothy's haunted face in that 1903 portrait had captured something far more sinister than mere childhood unhappiness. But what had really happened to him? Hayes's investigation took a darker turn when she discovered that some of Salem's oldest medical practices had preserved patient records dating back to the early 1900s. Among them was the old Salem General Medical Practice, now privately owned by Dr. Patricia Walsh. In the dusty basement archives, Hayes unearthed a box of brittle folders, and among them, one marked T. Blackwood Confidential Family Account. Inside, the truth began to take shape. There were records of repeated visits between 1901 and 1905, all written in the meticulous hand of Dr. Edmund Foster. The details were devastating. Broken ribs, deep bruises in various stages of healing, malnutrition. The notes described what Dr. Foster called nervous disorders, a polite euphemism in that era for what modern psychology would recognize as symptoms of severe trauma. One entry dated March 1904 read, "Young Timothy presents with fresh contusions on his back and arms. Family claims child is accident-prone, but pattern of injuries suggests deliberate infliction. Child exhibits extreme fear when adults approach and flinches at sudden movements." The file went on correspondence between Dr. Foster and colleagues in Boston. In one letter, his tone shifted from professional to desperate. "I am faced with a moral dilemma regarding the Blackwood child." He never finished the sentence. What moral dilemma could have silenced a physician in 1904? And how much did the rest of Salem know about the horrors that may have been unfolding behind the walls of the Blackwood mansion? Hayes closed the file with trembling hands. Somewhere within the dust and shadows of that grand house, the story of Timothy Blackwood was waiting to be heard, a story his family had tried for over a century to bury. The evidence of abuse is clear. Dr. Foster had written his handwriting trembling across the page. Yet, the family's prominence in Salem makes accusations dangerous to my practice and my reputation. Those were among the last words the doctor ever recorded about the Blackwoods. Hayes read them aloud in the dim light of her office. The ink faded, but the fear still tangible. What kind of power could silence a man who had sworn an oath to protect the innocent? Within the same file, she discovered something even more disturbing. Hand-drawn sketches and small faded photographs that Dr. Foster had apparently taken to document Timothy's condition. Each image revealed the slow unraveling of a child's body and spirit bruises along his ribs, marks on his back, the haunted stillness of a boy who had long since learned that tears changed nothing. Then, without warning, the documentation stopped. Late 1905, no further notes, no final report. Had Dr. Foster been threatened, silenced, or simply disappeared from the case by those who wished to keep the Blackwood reputation intact? The remaining pages offered another revelation, one that chilled Hayes to the core. Timothy had been kept isolated from the outside world, the family claiming he suffered from a contagious illness. That lie, repeated in official papers and social gossip, explained why Timothy had never appeared in school records or local events. He had not been sick, only hidden, a prisoner in his own home. That knowledge cast a new and terrible light on the 1903 photograph. What had once seemed a tender family portrait now stood as perhaps the only surviving evidence of Timothy's silent cry for help, a desperate fragment of truth that had somehow escaped destruction for more than a century. Hayes pressed on. She began examining employment ledgers from the Blackwood household, hoping that a maid, a cook, a butler, anyone might have seen what was happening behind closed doors. Through old agency records, she traced several domestic servants who had worked for the family in the early 1900s. One name stood out: Mary O'Sullivan. To Hayes's surprise, O'Sullivan had written a memoir, late in life, Serving the Rich, a domestic's truth privately published in 1945 and long forgotten. A single dusty copy rested in the archives of the Salem Historical Society. Opening it, Hayes felt the tone shift instantly from genteel recollection to something darker. O'Sullivan described her years in the Blackwood mansion between 1902 and 1905 as the most disturbing chapter of my 40 years in service. Her words breathed life and pain into the shadows Dr. Foster had only hinted at. Young Master Timothy was treated more like a prisoner than a child, she wrote. He was confined to a small room on the 3rd floor and forbidden to mingle with his siblings. His meals were brought to him in silence. The housekeepers spoke of him in whispers as though he were a ghost haunting the upper hall. According to O'Sullivan, Charles Blackwood justified the boy's isolation by claiming Timothy was mentally defective and dangerous to himself and others. But to her eyes, Timothy was neither violent nor broken. He was, as she described, a gentle and intelligent child whose only fault was asking why his father was so quick to anger. Her account grew heavier with each paragraph. She described seeing Charles Blackwood strike Timothy with a leather strap for the smallest mistakes and force him to remain silent whenever guests were present. While laughter filled the parlor below, she recalled the boy sat locked in his room, above, forbidden to make a sound that might disturb the perfect image of family harmony. But the passage that stopped Hayes's breath was the one describing the day of the photograph. The photographer insisted all 4 children be included. Mr. Blackwood hesitated but finally agreed. Young Timothy was brought down from his room, pale, trembling, and afraid to meet anyone's gaze. His eyes, I shall never forget them. They begged for escape, but he dared not move nor cry. That picture captured more truth than anyone realized. O'Sullivan ended her chapter with words that lingered long after Hayes closed the book. I failed that innocent child by not speaking when I should have. His eyes in that family portrait still haunt my dreams. It was confirmation the 1903 photograph had not merely suggested fear. It had preserved it. A single moment of terror frozen forever, outlasting even the walls that once confined him. But Hayes's search wasn't over. Among newly uncovered correspondence in the New York Historical Society, she found letters between Margaret Blackwood and her sister Eleanor Whitman, written in the same years O'Sullivan had served the family. Their exchanges, full of careful phrasing and veiled hints, began to reveal something else. Something far more twisted than simple cruelty. They spoke, it seemed, of beliefs of sins that needed to be corrected of a child marked by inheritance. And for the first time, Hayes began to wonder what if the abuse had not been driven by shame or anger alone, but by faith twisted into something unrecognizable. What could a mother justify when she believed she was saving her child's soul? The letters between 1902 and 1906 unveiled the quiet horror that had long been buried within the Blackwood family. Margaret Blackwood had written in trembling ink to her sister Eleanor not once but again and again about the growing tension surrounding her son Timothy. It seemed that Charles Blackwood, once a proud and respected man of Salem, had convinced himself that Timothy was not his biological child. His suspicion, born perhaps from jealousy or guilt, had become an obsession. In one letter dated January 1903, Margaret confessed Charles's suspicions about Timothy have grown unbearable. He claims the boy bears no resemblance to our family. He treats him not as a son but as a burden. I fear for Timothy's safety, yet Charles forbids me to interfere. But the truth hidden between those letters was darker still. Charles's cruelty was not random, it was rationalized, cloaked in the language of discipline and morality. He believed that isolating Timothy would save the rest of the family from what he called the boy's moral contagion. In his mind, this was correction, not punishment. Eleanor's replies revealed the helplessness of those who watched from afar. She pleaded, "You must protect your son, Margaret. Charles's behavior is beyond cruel, it is criminal. No child deserves such torment." And yet, Margaret's own letters show a tragic complicity. Fearful of scandal, she allowed silence to replace protection. In one of her final letters, she wrote, "I should do more for Timothy, but Charles threatens to expose what he calls my adultery. If that truth or lie is made public, we would be ruined." The story that followed reads like a slow descent into betrayal. Charles began writing to various institutions, searching for a place that would take his son away permanently. He says it will be better for everyone, Margaret wrote, especially for Timothy. Her words trembled between guilt and surrender. When historian Eleanor Hayes retraced these steps decades later, she reached out to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an expert on early 20th century mental health facilities. Together, they unearthed the final chapter of Timothy's life. In late 1905, Charles succeeded. Through bribery and deceit, he had Timothy, just 8 years old, committed to the Riverside State Hospital for the mentally defective. The admission forms, signed by a compliant doctor and a magistrate on the Blackwood payroll, described the boy as violently insane. But when Dr. Mitchell uncovered the hospital's surviving archives, the truth came out. Timothy had been renamed Thomas Brown and quietly erased from the family's history. Riverside was not a hospital, but a hidden prison for the unwanted. Children from wealthy families were sent there under false names, out of sight, out of memory. And yet, among the yellowed records, one detail stood out. The staff described Thomas Brown as gentle, bright, and obedient. No violence, no madness, only silence. A silence that still seems to echo. The 1903 photograph, once thought to be a simple portrait of a proud family, had in truth captured a silent plea that went unheard for more than a century. Timothy Blackwood's frightened gaze, frozen in that moment, became the voice of a child who had never been allowed to speak. When the Massachusetts Attorney General's office reopened the case, there was no one left to punish. The Blackwoods had long since passed into history. But that wasn't the point. This investigation wasn't about vengeance. It was about acknowledgement, about setting the record straight. For the first time, the state officially recognized that Timothy had been falsely labeled insane, wrongfully confined, and deliberately erased. As researchers began to look deeper into the history of Riverside State Hospital, a terrible pattern emerged. Dozens of children, sons and daughters of families desperate to protect their reputations, had been sent there to disappear. Most never came home. Many were buried in unmarked graves, their names missing from every record. Working side by side with genealogists, Eleanor Hayes began tracing the descendants of these forgotten children. Their discoveries gave birth to something extraordinary, a movement to remember them. A century of silence finally began to break. In Salem, the Historical Society unveiled a permanent exhibit dedicated to Timothy's story. At its center hung the 1903 photograph, now reinterpreted not as a family keepsake, but as evidence a window into cruelty hidden behind respectability. Visitors often said they could feel Timothy's eyes following them, asking for something only the living could now give remembrance. And slowly, his story began to ripple outward. Child protection advocates across the country invoked his name in classrooms, in policy discussions, in every space where silence once shielded abusers. They argued that Timothy's case proved a truth society had long ignored, that no child's suffering should ever be dismissed in the name of privacy, family honor, or convenience. 2 years after Hayes first noticed that haunted expression the boy once forgotten had become a symbol of justice. What began as a simple estate catalogue had evolved into one of the most important revelations in modern child welfare history. The Timothy Blackwood Foundation was established to identify and memorialize other lost children of the early 1900s, victims of respectability, silence, and power. Researchers found that Timothy's story was not unique. In fact, it was heartbreakingly common. Among the wealthy and powerful, unwanted children were quietly institutionalized or worse, erased from the family record altogether. And so Salem's mayor issued a formal apology. Timothy Blackwood was failed by every institution that should have protected him, the proclamation read. We cannot undo what was done, but we can ensure his story reminds us of the duty we owe to every child. The Blackwood Mansion, once a home of fear and secrets, was transformed into a center for child advocacy. The 3rd floor, where Timothy had been confined, became a memorial room. The same window that once framed his isolation now looked out onto a small garden planted in his memory. At the center of the exhibit hung the photograph again. Timothy's expression, no longer just sorrowful, had become something else entirely, a call to action. Dr. Rodriguez, whose psychological analysis helped define the case, often told her students, "Everything we need to know about recognizing a child in distress is in that photograph. He's been teaching us for 100 years. We just needed to learn how to listen." Hayes herself reflected softly. "When I first saw that picture, I was simply sorting through forgotten things. I never imagined it would reveal so much about cruelty, about courage, and about the power of truth to heal." The site of Riverside State Hospital was later turned into a memorial park. A stone monument rose from the grass, carved with the names of all the children who had perished there, Timothy's name at last among them. The inscription read, in memory of the children whose voices were silenced, whose stories were buried, and whose suffering was ignored. May their memory remind us to protect all children. And so a photograph meant to preserve a family's pride became something far greater, a testament. Timothy's face, once lost to history, now spoke for every child who had ever been silenced. It proved in the end that truth may sleep for a century, but it never truly dies.